A king who did not know Joseph. This is going to be a quick look into the historical background of the Exodus. At church this year, we've been looking at the overall story of the Old Testament, starting at the beginning. Last week, we looked at the story of Joseph, and given that Mark is going to be opening the Exodus this next week, I thought it would be fitting to look into some of the historical background behind the story of the Exodus. This is not intended to be an exhaustive look. Hopefully, it won't be exhausting. Certainly is not the best. There are many videos out there on YouTube that have much more detail on this and are much better than this, but hopefully this is going to be a quick look at the story. So let's dive in. Some scripture first. Exodus 1, 8 through 11. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and, if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us, and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. What's happening here? It's very simple. A new king comes to power. He doesn't remember Joseph. Joseph was relatively powerful in the end of Genesis. He fears that the Israelites are going to rise up against them, and so he puts them into slavery. Where are we in this story? If you've missed the last couple of weeks, last week we learned that Joseph had 12 sons. Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph, being the second youngest, is considered the heir by his father, and so his brothers, out of jealousy, sold him into slavery in Egypt. However, he rises to power, and when his brothers come to Egypt to buy grain during a famine, Joseph reveals himself to them, forgives them, and invites them all down to Egypt. So the story of Joseph ends with Israel prospering in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. So, question is, who was this king that arose that didn't know about Joseph, and why didn't he talk about Joseph? To do this, we're going to dive into some Egyptian history, and this is something that I'm very excited about. Hopefully it'll be interesting to you as well. Egyptian history is broken into 3 kingdom periods and some intermediate periods in between. The oldest kingdom is when the pyramids were built. This is hundreds of years before the time of Joseph and even Abraham. And this is the first period of Egyptian kingship. Then the Middle Kingdom is when Egypt's culture, wealth, and religion really becomes a massive thing. Egypt is a real power at this point. But then comes the second intermediate period between the Middle and the New Kingdom, and during this time there's going to be some folks showing up called the Hyksos, and we're going to talk about them in a moment. Lastly, the New Kingdom is the part that we're most familiar with. It's where you've got the Exodus, the golden age of Egyptian military, and ultimately their decline. So a lot of characters like King Tut come from this time period. So we mentioned the second intermediate period and the arrival of the Hyksos. So this is about a 100-year period when these Asiatic, Semitic, Canaanite people migrate into Egypt. And their name means rulers of foreign lands. Did they call themselves the Hyksos? No. Is this like an official people name of them? No, this is just a name that we have found that the Egyptians may have used to refer to their Canaanite overlords, so to speak. We are unsure if this was an invasion or a gradual migration. Did they come in with a massive army and conquer Egypt, or was it that Semitic people gradually moved into Egypt and eventually took over? They did bring some neat military advantages that gave them advantages over the ethnic Egyptians. The chariot is probably the biggest one. Probably the pharaoh that Joseph rose up under was one of these Asiatic, Semitic Hyksos. I say probably because in the realm of ancient history, there are few certain things. There's so much unknown, so I'm going to say probably that the pharaoh of Joseph was one of these Hyksos, which explains why he was able to rise up in power so quickly. So where were the native Egyptian rulers? If you look at the map on the right, you'll see a yellow section on the top. That is the area of Egypt that was ruled by these Hyksos. At the bottom, you see a brown area that is Cush, that they are a separate power. And then in the middle, you see Dynasty 16, XVI. That is where the Egyptians, the native Egyptian rulers, retreated to. So they were hemmed in by the Hyksos to the north and Cush to the south, and Thebes was their capital. So that's where the native Egyptian rulers were. Up at the top, you'll notice a green triangle called the Delta of the Nile, and in that there is a little star with the name Avaris next to it. Avaris was the capital of the Hyksos, and probably where many archaeologists believe the Israelites settled in large numbers. So that name will come up in a moment. The empire strikes back. On the right, we have a good-looking gentleman. He is 3,700 years old, so before you judge, just imagine that if you were 37 years old, 3,700 years old, you probably wouldn't look this good. The Egyptians begin to rebel against their Hyksos overlords. The first gentleman, this character on the right, he is probably captured and executed on the battlefield. People think that there is an axe wound on his head, and his body is partially decomposed before they mummified him, which is why they think that he died that way. But he was the first leader to begin leading the Egyptians against the Hyksos. So it all starts with him. Then his two sons, the older brother Chamos and Achmos, take the battle to the Hyksos. Ultimately, they fight against Avaris, which is the capital, and drive them out. Chamos dies, Achmosi survives, and the Egyptians take back the land for themselves. And Ahmosi the first becomes the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty and the first pharaoh of that new kingdom that we mentioned earlier. Note, this is not the pharaoh of the Exodus. Not the pharaoh of the Exodus. He will come multiple hundreds of years later. But this is the Egyptians, the ethnic Egyptians, taking back their land for themselves. Now, think about how the Israelites would have been perceived by the Egyptians. Here at Avaris, you have Israelites who were racially, ethnically, culturally the same as those people who had oppressed the Egyptians for over 100 years. The Israelites were living in the same area controlled by their enemies. Avaris is where most people think that the Israelites had settled. It's the equivalent of the land of Goshen. And the Israelites were multiplying and becoming a threat that could cost the Egyptians their homeland again. So when we say a new king arises, this is not a small event. This is the Egyptians taking back their land. This is the beginning of an event that will unify Israel. And this is the setting that God is going to use to show his power and free his people from slavery. So, quick takeaways. This is mostly a historical look, but God can take even the worst situations and use them to show his power. He put Israel in the situation where the government that they were familiar with was crushed, and people who had been oppressed for hundreds of years now are ruling over them. And I imagine that things were not easy for the Israelites or any of the Semitic people in that area during those times. Second of all, the Exodus is a great reminder that Jesus wants to free us from slavery, from bondage, no matter how powerful that might seem. Egypt was a powerful nation at this point in time, and they grew. The 18th and 19th dynasties were incredibly powerful, and that was a setting that God used to free his people and give them a new identity with himself. So, when you think about a new king rising who did not know Joseph, think about the Hyksos, think about rebellion, and a new kingdom.